Now, as the war continues to rage in Ukraine, the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development is warning about the impact of rising food prices and shortages of staple crops already being felt in the Near East and North African region and spreading to the world's most vulnerable countries, including the Horn of Africa, with poorest people at greatest risk. This comes amidst mounting concerns by the international community that the ongoing conflict will escalate global hunger and poverty. Now, Paul Melly is a reporter at the researcher Chatham House in the UK and is joining me via Zoom to discuss the impact of the war on food security in East and North Africa. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Paul. What's your reading of the crisis in Ukraine and the impact it's having on food security already being felt in the Near East North Africa region?
I think this economic dimension to the impact of the crisis is something that at first people had perhaps not focused on. The preoccupation in terms of the impact for Africa was looking at how African countries voted in the United Nations, for example, whether they voted to condemn or not, those sort of political questions. But now as we see the huge economic impact, we can see that for African countries, it's going to affect both the supply of food directly for those countries that import, particularly import the cereals that Ukraine and Russia produce. So, for example, wheat. So that's going to be very evident in North African countries and in those other African countries where people import wheat in large volumes. So, for example, some of the coastal West African countries where people are in the habit of importing wheat, for example, countries such as Cote d'Ivoire, for example, where people produce a lot of, or Burkina Faso, where people produce bread using flour imported from Europe or wheat imported from Europe to make into flour. But we also have an impact in terms of the secondary consequences, because you have the cost of oil and the cost of gas going up. So the cost of energy, that will feed also into the food chain in terms of all the costs associated with transformation, production, transporting food. So right across the economic agenda, African countries are going to feel a very severe shock. It won't just be in supplies of grain for those countries that import grain of the types of grain produced in Russia and Ukraine, but more generally, even countries which import other products, other food products, not even cereals, but of course they have to come by sea, so the rising cost of fuel will affect shipping costs, production costs, tractors in those parts of the continent where agriculture is more mechanized. Right. All of these costs are going to get pushed up.
Well, the humanitarian crisis in countries like Somalia, which is badly affected by years of droughts, forcing at least more than 6,000 persons away from their homes, has been further exacerbated by that of the Russian invasion. And many aid donors are focused on this country. What do you think can be done as a palliative for these African countries, at least in the short term?
I think in the short term, the donor system, the international emergency humanitarian aid system, will nevertheless maintain support for African countries. And we know there's a huge problem for Somalia, but there's also, for example, in the Sahel and in northern Nigeria, we have a huge humanitarian challenge. The RPCA Food Security Network, which focuses on West Africa and the Sahel, has forecast that 33 million people in West Africa will be in a food crisis by June to August this year. That forecast was already made even before the war in Ukraine. And I think the international donor system will be organized to respond to those needs. But over time, in the longer term, there will be quite a challenge, but it's possibly more on the development aid side because the political attention of many governments will be focused on trying to help Ukraine and helping Ukraine rebuild And so that may be the challenge. It's not so much, I think, will the food aid immediately be available? I think the international donor system is sufficiently well embedded, if you like, and well coordinated with African governments. They know that they need to tackle African food crises anyway. That is it. Yeah, in place. I don't think Ukraine will roll out.
Sorry to button.
But it's more about the political later on.
Absolutely. Sorry to button. It's so grave that those in Somalia tend to, be looking at whenever they see vehicles, they rush to it, thinking it's food aid, but definitely it's not really coming forth. But the Kremlin said that an embargo on Russian oil imports pushed for by some European countries over Moscow's military action in Ukraine would have a direct impact on everyone. So for how long would Russia continue to pound Ukraine? Is there any end in sight, do you think?
I don't have any expertise on Russian politics, so I don't know how long this war will go on. When one listens to the expert watchers of Russian policy, of Kremlin policy, they seem to think it could continue for a few more weeks or even some months. But I suspect that the impact of international sanctions and the pressure on Russia could go on rather longer than that, because after all, there was a political dispute, if you like, that was broadly peaceful, apart from some occasional small clashes on the ceasefire line between those eastern areas in Ukraine and the rest of Ukraine. And out of that situation, Russia chose to engage in this large-scale invasion. So after that lesson, I think that European governments in particular, and the US, will take a very tough stance on sanctions for a very long period, even when the fighting ended. I don't think that the sanctions impact is going to cool anytime soon, and it may be that European countries will actually toughen their attitude to Russian imports of energy, oil and gas from Russia, even after the fighting does stop.
Right. Well, it does sound so bewildering to realize that Russia is really obstinate in its onslaught against Ukraine. But then we'll leave it here. Reporter at the Researcher, Chatham House in the UK, Paul Melly. Thank you very kindly for your insight.
Thank you.